Grace sat before the blank canvas, her fingers curled around a brush that hadn't touched paint in months. The cottage's air was sharp, with late autumn's bite seeping through the cracked window pane like a whisper of defeat. In the corner, Ember's eyes glinted twin moons in the shadowed dusk, watching her without moving. His stillness was not peace, but a heavy, unspoken verdict, as if he saw the hollow space where her colors used to live. The silence between them stretched taut, a canvas of its own waiting for a stroke neither could muster. Outside, the wind moaned low and restless, carrying the faint scent of frost and something older, ash perhaps, or memory. Grace's chest tightened her breath, a ghost in the cold, and she wondered if the dog judged her for failing to fill the emptiness. The cottage crouched in the frost-draped fields, its sagging roof a bowed head under the weight of years. Grace traced the peeling wallpaper with her eyes, noticing faint scorch marks, black veins spidering up the wall, hidden unless the light hit just right. Ember stirred his claws, scraping the warped floorboards as he dragged a rusted lantern from the shadows, its metal frame clinking like a broken bell. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp wood and a ghost of smoke, as if the walls exhaled a secret. The lantern settled at Grace's feet, its glass cracked but intact, reflecting the dim glow of her single lamp. Ember's singed fur caught the light, a map of old wounds, and his low huff seemed to say, "Look closer." Outside, fog curled like fingers around the windows, pressing in, watching. Grace's hand hovered over the palette, the colors blurring into a muddy haze through unshed tears she refused to acknowledge. Asterisk. Why can't I just paint asterisk? The thought looped in her mind like a frayed thread, pulling tighter with each silent minute. She set the brush down, its soft clink against the wood, echoing louder than it should, a tiny surrender that made her chest ache. Her gaze drifted to the window where the fog pressed like forgotten dreams, and she felt the weight of the empty room settle deeper. No voices, no warmth, just the ghost of what she'd lost. A failed love, perhaps, or the sibling who'd vanished into silence years ago. It didn't matter, the void was the same. Ember shifted in the corner, his breath a rhythmic sigh, and Grace flinched, her fingers clenching into fists. Don't look at me like that, asterisk, she thought, though he hadn't moved. His presence was a mirror she didn't want reflecting her numbness back at her. She rose abruptly, knocking over a jar of water that spilled across the floor in slow, accusing rivulets. The cold seeped through her socks, but she didn't bend to clean it, what was one more mess in a life already stained. Instead, she turned away, hugging her arms to her body, the silence screaming in her ears. Ember's eyes followed her unblinking, as if he understood the paralysis better than she did. Her breath hitched a subtle crack in the armor, and for a moment the room spun with the effort of holding it all in. Asterisk. Just breathe asterisk, she told herself. But the air tasted like ash, and the lantern at her feet seemed to pulse with a light she hadn't lit. Ember's ears perked a subtle twitch in the dim light, as if catching a whisper from the walls themselves. Grace paused, her hand brushing the lantern's cold metal, and on impulse she struck a match, the flame leaping to life with a hiss that cut the silence like a promise. The glow spread warm and unsteady, casting long shadows that danced across the scorch marks, making them writhe like living scars. Ember whined softly, a sound low and plaintive, his gaze fixed on the flickering light, as if it held a memory he couldn't escape. Grace felt a chill unrelated to the frost outside, a sense that something buried was stirring, watching from the edges of the room. The dog's tail thumped, once hesitant, a gesture that hinted at alliance, at truths waiting to unfold. The canvas in her mind was once alive with strokes of crimson and gold, a testament to the woman Grace had been before the unraveling. Years ago, in the sun-drenched studio of her city apartment, she had painted feverishly, her laughter mingling with the scent of turpentine and fresh coffee shared with her fiancé, Elias. He had been her muse and anchor, his steady hands framing her wild visions until the accident, a screech of tires on a rain-slick road, stole him away, leaving her with a silence that swallowed her colors whole. Flashbacks came unbidden now. The hospital room's sterile white, the doctor's voice like distant thunder, and the empty chair beside her bed where he should have sat. She had fled the city after that, trading bustling galleries for this remote cottage, hoping isolation would mend what grief had fractured. But the move only deepened the void. Her brushes gathered dust. Her sketches turned to ash in her fireplace. Each failed attempt a reminder of the vitality she'd lost. Ember's presence stirred something in those memories, his scarred fur echoing her invisible wounds. His watchful eyes, like Elias's, had been patient and knowing. Grace turned from the window, her fingers tracing the edge of a faded photograph tucked in her drawer, the one where they smiled under a summer sky. Asterisk. Why did I survive? Asterisk. The question haunted her nights, a shadow that grew longer with each passing season. The cottage's walls seemed to lean in, absorbing her regret, while outside, the frost-etched patterns on the glass like forgotten masterpieces. Grace's days blurred into a monotonous rhythm, each one a careful construction of barriers against the world. She rose with the pale dawn, brewing coffee that tasted like watered-down memories, her movements mechanical as she avoided the mirror's accusing stare, her eyes too hollow, her hair a tangled testament to neglect. The cottage's empty rooms amplified her solitude. She paced the creaking floors, sketching half-hearted lines on scraps of paper, only to crumple them, the sound a muffled cry in the quiet. Ember lay in his corner, a silent sentinel, his breathing the only companion to her thoughts, which circled like vultures. Don't feel, don't remember. She ignored the growing pile of unopened mail from old friends, their words too vibrant for her faded existence, and instead stared at the blank canvas, willing colors to appear that never did. The lantern sat untouched, now its glow from that first night, a forbidden temptation, stirring questions she buried under routine, feed the dog, stoke the fire, watch the fog roll in. Ember's ritual had become part of the backdrop, his dragging of the object a peculiar punctuation to her evenings. But she kept her distance, her emotional armor thick as the frost outside. He's just a dog, asterisk, she told herself, though his gaze pierced her defenses, reflecting the paralysis she couldn't name. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a weight pressing down until even breathing felt like effort. The cottage a cocoon of numbness where hope had long since withered. Ember's fur was a patchwork of scars, singed black at the edges, as if the fire had tried to claim him, but failed. His eyes, amber and unyielding, carried the weight of survival, flickering with a wariness that made Grace's heart clench. Each night he dragged the rusted lantern across the cottage floor, his claws scraping a rhythm like a heartbeat against the wood, deliberate and obsessive, as if the act were a prayer to keep some memory alive. His movements spoke of a past where trust was shattered, flashes of a kennel filled with smoke, human voices shouting, then fading into the roar of flames. Grace imagined him cowering, his massive frame curled tight, ears pinned as the world burned around him, the lantern his only witness left behind in the wreckage of a family he couldn't save. His ribs showed faintly under his coat, a testament to months of scavenging before the shelter found him, yet his strength endured, coiled in the tense lines of his body. When he paused by the lantern, nosing its cracked glass, a low whine escaped, not fear, but something deeper, grief perhaps, or a need to show what he could not speak. The smell of ash seemed to cling to him, a ghost of the fire that had taken everything but his will to endure. Grace watched her own pain stirring as Ember's ritual became a mirror to her own refusal to let go of the past, his silent suffering a language she was beginning to understand. In the dim light of the cottage, Grace and Ember were two shadows cast by the same broken lantern, their silence weaving a fragile thread between them. When Grace's hand trembled, dropping a pencil to the floor, Ember's ears flicked, his body tensing, as if the sound were a spark that could reignite his past. She saw herself in that flinch, the way her own heart stuttered at the memory of Elias's laughter, now just an echo in her empty chest. Neither sought closeness yet. Ember kept to his corner, his gaze darting to the lantern, as if it held answers, while Grace busied herself with meaningless tasks, stacking dishes, folding blankets, avoiding the canvas that mocked her. But in quiet moments their eyes met, and Grace felt a jolt of recognition. His wariness was her own, his scars a map of her unseen wounds. One evening she lit the lantern on impulse, its glow revealing the scorch marks on the wall, and Ember didn't retreat. He sat closer, his breath steadying as if her act acknowledged his ritual. The air softened, the smell of frost mingling with ash, and Grace's fingers twitched, wanting to sketch the curve of his ears, the first urge to create in months. Their pain was a shared language, unspoken but palpable, and in that silence a bond began to form not of words, but of presence. Two souls circling the same darkness, each a faint light for the other. The fog clung to the cottage like a shroud, muffling the world outside as night deepened its hold. Grace stirred from her chair, the creak of wood echoing her unease when Ember's low growl pulled her gaze to the door. He paced his nails, clicking urgently, then nosed the lantern forward with a deliberate push, its metal scraping like a summons. The air grew thick, laced with the chill of impending rain and a faint acrid whiff of old smoke that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Grace knelt, her heart pounding in sync with the distant thunder, and turned the lantern in her hands. There, etched faintly on the base, was an inscription, "To the Harlows with light eternal." Ember's eyes locked on hers, wide and insistent, his body trembling not from cold but from some inner storm. The shock hit her like a gust through the cracks. This wasn't just a relic. It was a clue tied to a family, a fire, a loss that mirrored her own. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the windows, as if urging her to listen, to see the urgency in Ember's stance, the way his ears flattened his tail low, a silent plea amid the chaos brewing. Grace's fingers tightened around the lantern, the cold metal biting into her skin as doubt flooded her mind like the fog outside. Asterisk. What if it's nothing? What if digging opens wounds I can't close? Asterisk. The thought twisted in her gut, logic warring with the pull of Ember's gaze, his whine a soft anchor in the storm of her hesitation. She set the lantern down, stepping back as if distance could silence the questions, her own grief still raw. Elias's absence, a shadow that made every risk feel like a plunge into darkness. Ember nudged it closer, his breath warm against her hand, a subtle sign that tipped the scale, not demand, but desperation, his eyes reflecting the same fear she harbored. Compassion surged, overriding the fear of caring too much, of losing again. She couldn't ignore the parallel, the way his trauma called to hers like an unfinished painting begging for color. Grace's resolve hardened like frost on the window pane, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she typed "Harlow Family Fire" into the search bar, the screen's glow casting her face in a spectral light. The cottage seemed to hold its breath, the wind outside rattling the door like an impatient visitor, while Ember pressed close, his warm flank against her leg, a grounding weight. Results flooded in old news clippings of a blaze that devoured a home not far from here, the lantern mentioned as a cherished heirloom, its light the last thing seen before the flames claimed everything. Asterisk. This is real. Asterisk. She thought, her pulse quickening with a mix of dread and purpose, the dog's steady gaze urging her onward like a beacon in the fog. She scribbled notes on a scrap of paper, the pencil scratching urgently, piecing together dates and names that wove a tapestry of loss mirroring her own. Ember's tail thumped softly once, an affirmation that shifted the air between them from stranger to ally. The messiness of it all hit her, unanswered questions spilling like the spilled water from days ago, but she didn't stop her commitment blooming imperfectly, a raw promise to chase the shadows away. Outside, rain began to patter, washing the world clean as Grace closed the laptop with a click, her eyes meeting Ember's in silent accord. Grace knelt beside Ember, the lantern's soft glow turning his eyes into pools of liquid gold, and whispered, "We'll figure this out, you and me." Her hand hovered, then gently placed a bowl of food before him, the steam rising like a veil between their worlds, carrying the scent of warmth and trust. He hesitated, his body tense as coiled wire, but then leaned in, taking a cautious bite, the crunch echoing in the quiet room like a seal on their unspoken pact. Asterisk. I can't fix the past. Asterisk. She thought her own scars aching in sympathy, but this act, impulsive, irreversible, felt like opening a door long bolted shut. The cottage's walls seemed to exhale, the scorch marks fading slightly in the light, as Ember's tail gave a tentative wag, his wariness softening into something vulnerable, raw. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his fur, feeling the heat of his skin beneath the singed patches, a bridge built from shared fragility. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming a rhythm of renewal, while inside, Grace felt the first stirrings of healing, a quiet vow to protect this survivor as he had begun to protect her secrets. The moment stretched messy with emotion, tears pricking her eyes, his breath steadying as their bond took root, a fragile flame against the encroaching dark. Ember circled the room with measured steps, his muscles taut under the scarred fur, keeping a deliberate chasm between himself and Grace. The cottage's air hung heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth filtering through the cracks, and his low growl rumbled like distant thunder when she shifted too close, a warning etched in the stiff line of his tail. Grace paused, her hand outstretched with a treat, but retracted it slowly, respecting the invisible barrier. He had drawn, his eyes sharp and untrusting, scanning her as if she were a potential flame in disguise. He's not ready, asterisk, she thought, mirroring her own guarded heart, the way she flinched from memories that crept too near. The lantern sat between them, unlit, a silent arbiter in their standoff, its metal cool to the touch, when Grace brushed it absent-mindedly. Ember settled in the far corner, his gaze never fully leaving her, a watchful sentinel whose silence spoke volumes of betrayals past. She moved about her routine, brewing tea, sketching faint lines on paper without pushing the space between them, a shared breath of caution, neither daring to bridge it first. The fog outside pressed against the windows, blurring the world, much like the haze of mistrust that kept them apart. Yet in that distance, a quiet understanding began to simmer, unspoken and tentative. Grace knelt by the hearth, the fire's crackle a soft counterpoint to the rain's persistent drum, and gently dabbed at a fresh scratch on Ember's flank with a damp cloth, the metallic tang of blood mingling with the wood smoke. He tensed, a ripple under his skin like a wave of suppressed memory, but didn't pull away his breath, coming in shallow huffs that echoed her own when grief surfaced unbidden. Asterisk. We both carry these asterisk, she mused, her fingers light, tracing the edge of an old burn scar that felt like the jagged remnants of her shattered engagement ring long discarded. The lantern flickered nearby, its light casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls, highlighting the scorch marks like veins of shared sorrow. Ember's eyes met hers for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they harbored, his from flames that devoured his world, hers from a loss that left her colors muted. She offered a morsel of bread from her plate, placed carefully on the floor between them, the steam rising like a fragile truce. He approached warily, sniffing before taking it, the crunch of his jaws a small symphony in the quiet room. In that moment the cottage felt less empty, their wounds a bridge rather than a divide, the light of the lantern illuminating not just the scars but the possibility of mending them together. Grace's fingers brushed against a cracked picture frame tucked in the cottage's dusty drawer. The glass splintered like her memories, sending a shiver through her, as Elias's face stared back, smiling alive before the crash stole him. The room spun, the scent of rain and wood smoke fading into the metallic tang of that rainy night, sirens wailing as she clutched his hand, whispering promises that dissolved into silence. Ember whined softly from across the room, his head tilting as if sensing the storm within her, and when she dropped the frame with a clatter, he didn't flinch. Instead he paused, his eyes softening, a subtle shift that spoke of his own fractured past. The lantern's glow caught the frame's edge, casting shadows that mimicked flames, pulling Grace into Ember's world, a vision of him cowering amid roaring heat, the Harlow's voices fading, the lantern tumbling as he fled into the night. Her breath caught the parallel, striking like a match, both of them relics of loss pieced together from shards. Ember edged closer, not touching but present his warmth, a quiet anchor that eased the grip of the flashback, allowing her to pick up the frame without trembling. In that gesture, unspoken, their connection deepened, the broken pieces of their histories aligning like a mosaic waiting for light. Grace tossed a crumpled sketch across the floor, watching it skitter like a leaf in the wind, and to her surprise, Ember lunged after it with a playful bound, his paws thudding softly on the wood as he batted it back toward her. A laugh bubbled up from her chest, unexpected and raw, the sound filling the cottage like sunlight piercing fog, warming the air that had long felt chilled. Ember's tail wagged tentatively, his eyes brightening the singed fur, catching the lantern's glow as he dropped the paper at her feet, inviting her into the moment. He's playing asterisk. She realized, her heart lightening, the gesture a spark against the numbness that had cloaked her days. She knelt, offering a treat from her palm, and this time he took it gently. his muzzle brushing her skin like a whisper of trust, the contact sending a ripple of warmth through her. The room transformed subtly. The scorch marks seemed less ominous, the rain outside a soothing rhythm rather than a barrier, as Ember relaxed, rolling onto his back for a brief, vulnerable exposé of his belly. Grace's fingers itched for her brush colors flickering in her mind for the first time in months, inspired by the curve of his ear, the gleam in his eye. Their shared ease grew a fragile flame, kindled by small joys, turning the cottage from a refuge of solitude into a space of tentative healing. The evening light filtered through the cottage windows, like honeyed regret, casting long shadows that softened the edges of the room where Grace sat, her sketchpad balanced on her knees. She drew absent-mindedly, lines curving into the shape of Ember's silhouette, each stroke a tentative reclaiming of her lost art. The air hummed with quiet, the distant drip of thawing frost outside, the faint crackle of the fire, and Ember, who had been pacing the perimeter like a guardian of forgotten borders, paused. His ears flicked forward then back as if weighing an invisible scale, and slowly, deliberately, he approached her chair. Grace's breath caught her pencil hovering mid-air as he leaned in, his massive head resting gently against her thigh, the weight warm and solid like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. He's choosing this asterisk. She thought, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and ache, the contact unlocking a floodgate she hadn't known was there. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and unbidden, as she set the pad aside, her hand descending slowly to his fur. No tension in his frame, no recoil, just a deep, rumbling sigh that vibrated through them both. The singed patches under her fingers felt like braille of survival, telling stories of flames and escape that mirrored her own nights of staring at ceilings, whispering Elias's name into the void. Ember's eyes closed halfway, trusting vulnerable, and he licked her wrist once, a rough tongue like sandpaper forgiveness. The lantern nearby seemed to glow brighter, its light a metaphor for this surrender, illuminating the cracks in their armor where healing could seep in. Grace buried her face in his neck, inhaling the musky scent of dog and earth, her sobs muffled but cathartic, releasing the pent-up grief that had kept her isolated. Ember didn't move away. Instead, he pressed closer, his body a shield against the loneliness that had defined them both. In that prolonged moment, time stretched like taffy, the cottage transforming from a place of shadows to one of shared light, their bond sealing with the quiet power of mutual yielding. She stroked his ears, feeling the softness beneath the scars, and whispered, "Asterisk, thank you, asterisk," though the words were for both of them, for surviving, for reaching out. The peace that had settled over the cottage like a fresh snowfall began to fracture under the weight of unseen eyes, the air growing taut with an undercurrent of unease. Ember's ears perked suddenly in the dead of night, his body going rigid as a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, vibrating through the floorboards like a warning tremor. Grace stirred from her half-sleep on the couch, the lantern's dim afterglow casting flickering shapes on the walls, and she felt it too, a prickling at the nape of her neck, as if the fog outside had infiltrated the room, carrying whispers of old threats. "What's out there, asterisk?" she wondered, her pulse quickening, echoing the dog's alert posture, his hackles rising like frost-kissed spines. Ember stared at the window, unblinking his stillness, a primal signal that danger lurked beyond the glass, perhaps in the form of a silhouette she glimpsed earlier that day. "Mr." Grace's hands shook as she scrolled through the faded digital archives on her laptop, the screen's blue glow illuminating the cottage like a cold flame when a sharp rap at the door shattered the fragile quiet. Ember erupted his bark, a thunderclap that reverberated off the walls, his body launching toward the entrance with hackles raised like a crown of thorns, protective fury igniting in his eyes. "He's here, asterisk." Grace thought, her stomach twisting as Mr. Allen's silhouette loomed through the fogged glass, his familiar knock evasive, insistent, triggering a cascade of dread that flooded her veins like icy water. Ember's aggression peaked, snarls ripping from his throat as if the man's presence were a spark to dry tinder, his paws scraping the floor in a primal dance of defense rooted in the fire's betrayal. Flashbacks assaulted Grace, visions of the Harlow's home engulfed, screams swallowed by smoke and ember, then a loyal guardian howling in vain as flames licked at his fur, the same flames Alan had allegedly set for profit insurance papers fluttering like ashes in her mind. Her own emotions surged, anger bubbling up like bile, maternal instinct flaring not for a child, but for this scarred survivor who'd become her anchor. She shouted, "What do you want?" her voice cracking raw with the weight of unearthed truths. The door creaked open under Grace's hesitant hand, the fog slithering in like tendrils of doubt. And there stood Mr. Allen, his smile a thin veneer over calculating eyes that darted to the lantern glowing accusingly on the table. Ember's recognition was instantaneous, a guttural snarl exploding from his chest as he lunged forward, restrained only by Grace's desperate grip on his collar, his body a taut bowstring of primal fury aimed at the man who'd orchestrated the inferno. Asterisk. He knows him, asterisk. Grace realized, her blood turning to fire, the air thickening with the scent of rain and betrayal as Alan stepped inside uninvited, his boots tracking mud like evidence across the floor. "That dog's a menace," Alan muttered, his voice laced with false concern, but his gaze fixed on the lantern, the object that tied him to the arson for profit for land the Harlows reduced to cinders in his greed. The confrontation ignited, words flying like sparks, Grace's accusation. "You set that fire, didn't you, for the insurance?" her voice trembling yet steel-edged, while Alan's denial cracked, "Nonsense, girl." His face flushing, the standoff turning physical as he advanced, hand outstretched toward the lantern. Ember broke free momentarily, snapping at the air inches from Alan's leg, his teeth bared in a flash of white against the dim light, the room pulsing with tension like a heart on the verge of bursting. Grace's internal storm raged, fear coiling in her gut like smoke, resolve hardening like cooled ash as flashbacks assaulted them both. Ember's memories of flames roaring, Alan's shadow fleeing the scene, her own loss echoing in the void, Elias's absence a parallel wound. The emotional chasm widened, Alan's evasion, crumbling under Ember's unrelenting gaze, his presence a tangible threat that made the scorch marks on the walls seem to bleed anew. The door slammed shut behind Alan, the echo reverberating like a final gasp, leaving the cottage steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the patter of rain and Ember's panting breaths. Grace slid down against the wall, her knees buckling under the weight of the confrontation, tears streaming unchecked as she pulled Ember close, his fur damp with sweat and fog. He leaned into her, no longer growling but trembling slightly, his head resting on her lap in a gesture of exhausted solidarity, the warmth of his body a balm against the chill that had seeped into her bones. "It's over for now, asterisk," she thought, her fingers threading through his coat, feeling the rapid thrum of his heart slowing in tandem with hers, a shared rhythm of survival. The lantern's light dimmed, casting soft pools that hid the scorch marks once more, as if granting them a momentary reprieve from the past's glare. Regret washed over her, not for the standoff, but for the innocence lost, the trust shattered in both their lives. She whispered apologies into his ear, promises of protection that felt like vows etched in ash. Ember licked her hand, a rough affirmation, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that spoke of closure, the trauma's grip loosening just enough for breath. The days following blurred into a haze of heightened vigilance, the cottage's once comforting creaks now sounding like stealthy footsteps in the frost-crusted grass outside. Ember's instinct sharpened, his nose twitching at every shift in the wind, ears pivoting toward unseen rustles that made Grace's skin prickle with unease. She caught glimpses through the fogged windows, a shadow lingering at the tree line. Perhaps Alan's form, his evasive demeanor from their last encounter, now twisted into something predatory, watching with eyes like embers in the dusk. "He's not done, asterisk." She sensed her pulse echoing the dog's low, intermittent growls, the air thick with the scent of impending rain, an unspoken menace. Footprints appeared one morning, muddy imprints circling the property like a noose tightening each one, a signal that ratcheted the tension, Ember's body going rigid as he sniffed them, hackles rising in a silent alarm. The lantern, now a constant companion, flickered erratically during evenings, its light revealing nothing but amplifying the watchfulness that consumed them. Grace, peering out, hand on Ember's collar, feeling the tremor in his frame mirror her own growing dread. The tension shattered like glass underfoot when Alan burst through the cottage door one storm-lashed night, the wind howling behind him like a chorus of accusations, his face twisted in desperation, illuminated by the lantern's defiant glow. "You should have left it alone," he snarled, his voice cutting through the rain's roar, eyes wild as he revealed his greed, the arson plotted for insurance payouts and prime land redevelopment. The Harlows mere collateral in his scheme, their screams silenced by flames he had ignited with a flick of a match. Ember's reaction was explosive, a deep, resonant bark echoing off the walls as he positioned himself between Grace and the intruder, his body a shield of fur and fury teeth bared in a gleaming arc that promised retribution. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and the acrid phantom smoke that seemed to rise from the scorch marks now vivid under the escalating light. Alan advanced, a hidden knife glinting in his hand, a tool for silencing witnesses, his threat turning lethal as he lunged toward the lantern, intent on destroying the evidence that tied him to the crime. In the heart of the storm's fury, Grace's world narrowed to the glint of Alan's knife and Ember's defiant growl, the cottage a pressure cooker of tension ready to erupt. Asterisk. I have to choose now, asterisk. She thought, her breath ragged, the weight of inaction a chain that could drag them both under. Alan lunged again, his face a mask of rage, aiming for Ember, who stood unyielding, but Grace surged forward, grabbing the lantern and swinging it with all her might, the metal connecting with Alan's arm in a resounding clang, the impact sending sparks flying like fleeting stars. The knife clattered to the floor, skittering into shadows as Ember seized the opening, leaping onto Alan with paws pinning his chest jaws, hovering inches from his throat in a primal display of protection. Grace's decision crystallized, no more hiding, no more numbness. She snatched her phone from the table, fingers fumbling but resolute, dialing emergency services with a voice that trembled yet held firm. "There's an intruder," he confessed, "to arson, to murder." Alan thrashed beneath Ember's sputtering denials. "You can't prove it." But the dog's weight was an immovable force. His eyes locked on Grace's, a silent urging that transformed her fear into action. The emotional resolution washed over her like the rain outside catharsis, in the commitment, the bond with Ember forging her into a protector, mirroring how he'd shielded her heart from isolation. Thunder boomed, punctuating the standoff as sirens wailed in the distance, drawing nearer like justice's inexorable tide. Grace knelt beside Ember, her hand on his flank, feeling the rapid beat of his heart sync with hers, the irreversible change settling in. She had chosen to fight to rescue not just him, but herself from the ashes of loss. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving the cottage wrapped in a hush that felt like the world exhaling after a long-held breath. Grace slumped against the wall, her body heavy with the residue of adrenaline, the air still tinged with the sharp scent of rain and struggle. Ember limped slightly as he approached, his paw prints marking the floor in faint muddy trails, and settled beside her with a soft thud, his head nudging her hand in a gesture of quiet solidarity. She stroked his fur slowly, her fingers lingering on the fresh bruises, the motion deliberate and unhurried, each touch a pause in the narrative of chaos. The lantern toppled, but unbroken cast a subdued glow across the room, its light pooling in gentle waves that softened the edges of the scorch marks, now mere whispers on the walls. Grace's breathing deepened, syncing with Ember's rhythmic sighs, the silence not empty but filled with the subtle creaks of the settling house, the distant drip of water from the eaves. Days blended into a steady rhythm of recovery, the cottage's air growing lighter with each small act that wove Grace and Ember closer. She prepared meals with deliberate care, chopping vegetables whose crisp snaps echoed the breaking of old barriers, and Ember followed her shadow like his steps, syncing with hers, a silent testament to the trust blooming between them. When she sat to paint her brush, dipping into vibrant hues for the first time in ages, the scent of oil and canvas mingling like a fresh dawn ember lay at her feet, his eyes half closed in contentment, his tail thumping softly against the floor in approval. He ate from her hand now, his muzzle gentle, the warmth of his breath on her skin, a sensory bridge that mirrored her easing tension, her shoulders unclenching as colors flowed onto the page. In the evenings, by the lantern's steady glow, now a symbol of revelation rather than ruin, They shared space without words, Grace reading aloud from an old book, her voice a soothing cadence while Ember's ears perked his body, relaxing inch by inch, wounds fading under her tender care. Grace stepped out into the crisp morning air, the frost crunching under her boots like whispered secrets, Ember at her side, his stride matching hers in effortless harmony. The lantern dangled from her hand, unlit, now its weight a comforting reminder, rather than a burden, as they walked the field's edge, where sunlight pierced the lingering mist. Ember paused suddenly, his nose twitching at the ground, then looked up at her with eyes clear of shadows, resting his head against her leg, in a single profound act of surrender, the warmth of his breath mingling with hers, a release that washed away the last vestiges of fear. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, not sorrow, but catharsis, as she set the lantern down gently on a stump, its glass catching the light like a promise fulfilled. They continued on side by side, the motion of their steps, a quiet rebirth. Hands and paws in sync breaths aligned, the world unfolding before them, without the echo of flames.